Most men fail with women for one reason: they believe desire is moral, logical, or fair. In this video, we expose the illusion that effort creates attraction and reveal what studying 500 transactional women taught about power, desire, and human nature. This is not about women. This is about the rules you were never taught. Listen carefully, because this is where most men are deceived. When we studied 500 prostitutes, what appeared was not a scandal, not a moral lesson, but a mirror held up to desire itself. Strip away romance, promises, poetry, and social theater, and what remains is exchange. Not crude exchange, not money for flesh, but value for access, power for attention, certainty for surrender. Men are taught that love is sacred and separate from transaction. Yet the moment you remove illusion, you see the same mechanics operating everywhere, only disguised better in polite society. These women did not invent the rules. They learned them faster because their survival depended on clarity. In their world, there was no room for fantasy. Men arrived believing their feelings made them special, believing effort would be rewarded, believing sincerity was rare. And the women watched, silently, as the same patterns repeated again and again. The men who offered gifts too quickly were categorized. The men who confessed emotions too early were priced. The men who tried to buy affection were tolerated, never respected. What these women understood, and what Machiavelli warned centuries ago, is that people reveal their position the moment they reveal their need. Desire, when observed honestly, is not an act of generosity. It is a negotiation. Every look, every word, every pause communicates leverage. The men who believed attraction was earned through goodness were the easiest to control. They mistook availability for intimacy and effort for value. They gave more, spoke more, explained more, and with each offering, they lost weight in the exchange. Not because women are evil, but because human nature does not reward surrender. It exploits it. Transactional does not mean heartless. It means structured. Even in marriage, even in love, even in devotion, there is an unspoken balance of power. Who needs whom more? Who can walk away? Who is choosing and who is hoping? The prostitutes simply removed the veil. They saw that the men who treated desire like charity were always poor in the end. The men who treated it like currency, carefully spent, carefully withheld, commanded attention without begging for it. Machiavelli wrote that men are driven less by truth than by appearance. In desire, this law becomes absolute. A man who tries to prove his worth advertises doubt. A man who overinvests reveals fear of loss. And fear, once exposed, invites domination. The women learned to recognize this instantly. They did not respond to kindness the way men imagined. They responded to certainty, calm, emotional restraint. A man who did not rush to explain himself, who did not seek approval, who did not barter dignity for validation. This is where the illusion collapses. Society tells men that love should be unconditional, that effort should be pure, that wanting more should make you more attractive. But in reality, desire operates like markets do. Scarcity increases value. Confidence signals stability. Need signals risk. The prostitute sees this faster because she watches hundreds of men fail in identical ways, all believing their case is different, all convinced their intentions will save them. Transactional desire does not mean affection is fake. It means affection follows structure. The moment a man gives without leverage, he gives power away. The moment he centers his worth on being chosen, he places himself beneath judgment. And judgment never respects what kneels before it. The women did not mock these men. They simply categorized them: useful, predictable, temporary. What shocked the observer was not what the women did, but what the men believed. They believed honesty was strength. They believed consistency created safety. They believed giving more would be met with gratitude. But Machiavelli would recognize this as the oldest political error, mistaking virtue for power. Virtue without leverage is decoration. Desire without structure is charity. And charity in attraction is never repaid. This truth unsettles because it contradicts comforting narratives. Men want to believe they are loved for who they are. But desire does not function on identity. It functions on impact. How you make someone feel in your presence. How scarce your attention is. How little you need the outcome. The prostitutes learned to feel this instantly. The men who tried to purchase certainty were always the most uncertain. The men who acted as if they could leave at any moment were the ones who stayed longest in memory. This is not a lesson about women. It is a lesson about illusion. Remove morality, remove ego, remove hope, and watch behavior. When desire becomes transactional, it does not become ugly. It becomes honest. And honesty reveals what power truly is: not force, not money, not words, but the ability to walk away without explaining yourself, the ability to withhold without resentment, the ability to desire without surrendering your frame, the ability to participate in exchange without revealing hunger. the ability to remain whole even when nothing is promised, the ability to stand in front of desire without asking it to save you, the ability to understand that attraction is not a reward for effort, but a response to strength. And that strength is felt long before it is spoken, long before it is justified, long before it is proven, long before it is offered, long before it is needed, long before it is given, long before it is lost, long before it is remembered, long before it is mourned, long before it is missed, long before it is named, long before it is explained, long before it is understood, long before it is accepted, long before it is denied, long before it is replaced, long before it is gone, long before it ever had to be earned, long before it ever had to be asked for, long before it ever had to be paid for, long before it had to be promised, long before it ever had to be justified, long before it ever had to be forgiven, long before it ever had to be defended, long before it had to be secured, long before it ever had to be chased, long before it ever had to be proved, long before it ever had to be explained away, long before it ever had to be rationalized, long before it ever had to be redeemed, long before it ever had to be remembered as something it never truly was, long before it ever had to be mourned as something that was lost, long before it ever had to be rebuilt from fragments of illusion, long before it ever had to be learned the hard way, long before it ever had to be studied in shadows, long before it ever had to be observed where masks fall, long before it ever had to be acknowledged in silence, long before it ever had to be accepted without comfort, long before it ever had to be faced without hope, long before it ever had to be understood without consolation, long before it ever had to be endured without reward, long before it ever had to be carried without relief, long before it ever had to be lived without apology, long before it ever had to be seen without illusion, long before it ever had to be recognized as what it has always been, long before it ever had to be spoken aloud without fear, long before it ever had to be realized without escape, long before it ever had to be known without denial, long before it ever had to be endured without explanation, long before it ever had to be accepted as the price of clarity, long before it ever had to be understood as the cost of power, long before it ever had to be lived as truth rather than comfort, long before it ever had to be learned where desire stops pretending and starts revealing itself, long before it ever had to be seen in its purest form, where nothing is owed and everything is chosen, where nothing's promised and everything is negotiated, where nothing is guaranteed and everything is revealed, where nothing is free and nothing is wasted, where nothing is sacred and nothing is meaningless, where nothing is hidden and nothing is forgiven, where nothing is assumed and nothing is spared, where nothing is equal and nothing is fair, where nothing is romantic and nothing is cruel, where nothing is imagined and nothing is denied, where nothing is given and nothing is taken, where nothing is owned and nothing is begged for, where nothing is permanent and nothing is accidental, where nothing is safe and nothing is random, where nothing is moral and nothing is evil, where nothing is personal and nothing is distant, where nothing is simple and nothing is complicated, where nothing is innocent and nothing is guilty, where nothing is promised and nothing is returned, where nothing is earned and nothing is stolen, where nothing is fixed and nothing is stable, where nothing is pure and nothing is corrupt, where nothing is hidden behind words and nothing is softened by intention, where nothing is protected by belief and nothing is excused by effort, where nothing is spared by kindness and nothing is destroyed by cruelty, where nothing is sustained by hope and nothing is ended by despair, where nothing is resolved by explanation and nothing is healed by confession, where nothing is changed by pleading and nothing's preserved by sacrifice, where nothing is won by giving more and nothing is lost by giving less, where nothing is equalized by fairness and nothing is corrected by honesty, where nothing is secured by loyalty and nothing is threatened by distance, where nothing is preserved by trying harder and nothing is destroyed by restraint, where nothing is elevated by virtue and nothing is punished by vice, where nothing is guaranteed by love and nothing is forbidden by desire, where nothing is spared by intention and nothing is condemned by outcome, where nothing is hidden behind romance and nothing is protected by narrative, where nothing is explained away by culture and nothing is softened by myth, where nothing is excused by history and nothing is denied by tradition, where nothing is changed by wishing and nothing is fixed by hoping, where nothing is granted by effort and nothing is denied by patience, where nothing is created by need and nothing is sustained by fear, where nothing is given to those who ask and nothing is taken from those who wait, where nothing is rewarded for sincerity and nothing is punished for silence, where nothing is earned by being good and nothing is lost by being calm, where nothing is secured by proving yourself, and nothing is threatened by knowing yourself, where nothing is saved by explaining, and nothing is lost by withholding, where nothing is granted to those who kneel, and nothing is denied to those who stand, where nothing is romantic, and everything is real. Pay attention here, because this is where men sabotage themselves without realizing it. When the observer moved from numbers to behavior, from statistics to reactions, a pattern became impossible to ignore. The men who pleaded, who explained, who emotionally reached forward were not rewarded with closeness. They were met with distance. Not dramatic rejection, not cruelty, just a quiet loss of gravity. The room changed when they spoke. The energy shifted when they tried to convince. And the women felt it immediately, even if they could not explain it in words. Power, Machiavelli taught, is not loud. It does not beg. It does not rush to justify itself. And in attraction, power is felt before it is understood. The men who maintained emotional control, who did not react to every stimulus, who did not chase reassurance, who did not collapse inward when uncertainty appeared, were treated differently. They were listened to longer. They were negotiated with. They were respected even when they were not chosen. This is the uncomfortable truth. Desire does not respond to emotional exposure the way men are taught it should. Men are told that opening up builds connection, that vulnerability creates intimacy, that honesty earns trust. But in the arena of attraction, timing is everything. Emotional exposure without authority does not create closeness. It creates imbalance, and imbalance always shifts power away from the one who reveals first. The women learned this quickly because they watched men unravel in real time. A man would begin composed, confident, contained. Then he would lean forward emotionally. He would seek confirmation. He would ask where he stood. He would reveal how much the outcome mattered. And in that moment, his value dropped. Not morally, not personally, but strategically. He had declared dependence. He had surrendered leverage. He had placed the outcome above his own center. Machiavelli warned that the one who needs is already conquered. Emotional pleas are a form of need. They say without words, "You matter more to me than I matter to myself." And desire does not move toward what kneels. It evaluates it. It tests it. It often withdraws from it. Power in attraction is not dominance. It is self-regulation. It is the ability to feel without leaking, to want without chasing, to enjoy without clinging. The men who possessed this were not colder. They were steadier. They did not attempt to pull emotion from women. They allowed emotion to come to them. And this subtle difference changed everything. When a man tried to persuade, he lost authority. When he tried to explain himself, he exposed insecurity. When he tried to secure the future verbally, he revealed fear of loss. The women did not consciously punish this behavior. They simply felt less drawn to it. Attraction operates below morality. It does not reward effort. It responds to presence. This is why emotional control becomes magnetic, not because it is manipulative, but because it signals internal order. A man who can sit in uncertainty without collapsing communicates strength without speaking it. A man who does not react impulsively to rejection, silence, or delay demonstrates that his identity is not at stake. And nothing is more attractive than someone who does not need the moment to save them. The observer noticed something else. The men who pleaded believed they were being authentic. They believed they were showing depth. But what they were actually doing was outsourcing their emotional stability. They were asking women to regulate their anxiety, to reassure their worth, to anchor their sense of self. And this burden, once felt, killed desire, not because women are incapable of care, but because attraction does not grow under responsibility. Machiavelli understood that people admire what stands firm under pressure. Emotional control is pressure-tested composure. It is not suppression. It is mastery. The men who had it did not rush to label the connection. They did not demand clarity. They allowed ambiguity to exist without protest. And in doing so, they inverted the dynamic. They became the calm center while others orbited. This is where many men misinterpret advice. They hear, "Don't be emotional," and mistake it for being distant or cold. But the women were not drawn to absence. They were drawn to groundedness. Presence without desperation. Engagement without need. Interest without surrender. The difference is subtle but absolute. When a man pleads, he collapses the hierarchy. He places the other person above him. When a man maintains emotional control, he remains equal or higher. Not through force, but through self-command. And self-command is the rarest signal in modern relationships. Most people are ruled by impulse, by fear of loss, by the need to be chosen. The one who is not becomes instantly distinct. The women sensed this distinction instinctively. They did not debate it. They responded to it. The men who tried to win them over emotionally were processed like open books. Predictable, transparent. The men who remained emotionally sovereign created tension, curiosity, respect, not because they withheld affection, but because they did not hand over their nervous system. This is why power, not please, shapes attraction. Power is not control over others, it is control over oneself. And when desire meets self-control, it adjusts its behavior, it slows down, it pays attention, it stops taking and starts offering. It tests boundaries instead of exploiting them. It treats the man as a fixed point rather than a variable to be managed. The Observer wrote that the greatest mistake men made was believing emotional intensity could compensate for emotional discipline. It cannot. Intensity without control is chaos, and chaos invites either dominance or dismissal. Emotional control, on the other hand, creates structure. And structure is where attraction feels safe enough to grow, dangerous enough to stay interested, stable enough to return, uncertain enough to remain alert, balanced enough to avoid boredom, firm enough to resist manipulation, quiet enough to avoid exposure, patient enough to let others reveal themselves first, strong enough to endure silence, centered enough to allow desire to come forward on its own terms, powerful enough to remain unchanged by outcome, subtle enough to be felt rather than announced, disciplined enough to hold back words that weaken position, restrained enough to let tension do the work, composed enough to let others lean in, controlled enough to avoid chasing what should approach, grounded enough to remain whole even when nothing is promised, calm enough to remain desirable without asking, steady enough to remain respected without demanding, present enough to be felt without pleading, unmoved enough to be noticed without explaining, and sovereign enough to stand where emotion exists without being ruled by it, where attraction begins not with persuasion but with presence, where power is not asserted but sensed, where desire responds not to what is offered but to what remains contained, where the man does not reach outward for validation but stands inwardly complete, where emotion is felt but not leaked, where interest is shown but not begged, where connection is allowed but not forced, where silence is not feared, where uncertainty is not negotiated away, where composure becomes the message, where restraint becomes the signal, where self-command becomes the language, where the absence of pleading becomes the loudest proof of strength, where desire does not need to be convinced, only given the space to reveal itself, where power is no longer a tactic but a state, where attraction no longer reacts to words but to presence, where the rules stop being argued and start being obeyed, where the dynamic shifts without announcement, where the man no longer asks to be chosen, and something begins to move toward him without being called, without being chased, without being explained, without being promised, without being begged for, without being pulled, without being secured, without being guaranteed, without being negotiated, without being pleaded into existence, without being forced into clarity, without being rushed into definition, without being dragged by emotion, without being propped up by reassurance, without being stabilized by confession, without being justified by intention, without being protected by narrative, without being softened by sincerity, without being saved by vulnerability, without being rescued by effort, without being earned by suffering, without being bought by intensity, without being traded for self-respect, without being anchored by fear, without being sustained by hope, without being weakened by exposure, without being diminished by need, without being polluted by desperation, without being drained by explanation, without being lowered by pleas, without being cheapened by availability, without being dissolved by urgency, without being killed by overgiving, without being lost to the moment where power leaves the body and asks for permission to return, without being named, without being concluded, without being finished, without being closed, without being ended, without being resolved, without being sealed, without being answered, without being complete, without being safe, without being final, without being decided, without being claimed, without being surrendered, without being explained, without being wrapped, without being released, without being concluded, without being stopped, without being allowed to settle, without being given an ending, without being allowed to rest, without being put to sleep, without being concluded here, without being finished now, without being ended at this point, without being closed off, without being brought to a final sentence, without being given closure, without being allowed to stop, without being ended at all, without being finished. Stay with me here, because this is the point where most people confuse truth with power and lose both. When the Observer focused on communication rather than outcomes, a sharper pattern emerged. The men who believed honesty alone would protect them were the most exposed. They revealed intentions early. They clarified feelings too soon. They explained motives before being asked, and each time they did, something subtle broke. Not trust, authority, not connection, mystery. What they offered as sincerity was received as predictability. Machiavelli warned that men are judged by appearances long before intentions are considered. In attraction, this principle is merciless. What is revealed loses tension. What is explained loses weight. What is clarified too early loses power. The women did not punish honesty. They simply stopped feeling drawn to it when it arrived without strategy. Because honesty without restraint does not signal courage. It signals the need to be understood. The men believed that transparency created safety. They believed saying everything would eliminate misunderstanding. They believed clarity would accelerate closeness. But desire does not move on clarity. It moves on implication, on what is suggested but not confirmed, on what is felt but not explained. The moment a man laid out his internal world without being invited, he removed the work of discovery. And discovery is the engine of attraction. The women learned this not from theory but from repetition. They saw that men who narrated themselves lost gravity. Every explanation flattened their presence. Every confession made them easier to manage. Once a man's intentions were fully exposed, he stopped being a question and became a statement. And statements are either accepted or dismissed. Questions linger. This is where illusion becomes more valuable than truth. Not falsehood, but selective revelation. The art of revealing just enough to create engagement without surrendering position. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He knew that those who show all their cards invite control. Those who reveal selectively maintain agency. In desire, agency is everything. The men who believed honesty was a moral shield misunderstood the game. Desire is not a courtroom. It does not reward fairness. It responds to feeling, and feeling is shaped by uncertainty, anticipation, and perception. When a man rushed to define the connection, he collapsed the space where desire breathes. He replaced tension with certainty, and certainty, unless earned slowly, suffocates attraction. The women noticed that the men who said less were felt more. Not because they were deceptive, but because they allowed space for imagination. They did not correct every misunderstanding. They did not rush to clarify every silence. They allowed perception to do the work, and perception, once engaged, is far stronger than explanation. Machiavelli wrote that men see what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. In attraction, this is not a flaw. It is a feature. The men who tried to force others to see their true self missed the point. Attraction is not built by exposure. It is built by resonance. And resonance requires distance as much as closeness. The observer saw how quickly power shifted when a man overexplained. The moment he justified his actions, he placed himself on trial. The moment he defended his intentions, he accepted accusation. The moment he clarified feelings prematurely, he invited evaluation. And evaluation is not desire. Evaluation is judgment. The women did not need to manipulate these men. The men dismantled themselves. They believed being understood was more important than being respected. But respect precedes understanding. Without respect, understanding becomes leverage, and leverage, once handed over, is rarely returned. This is why illusion, carefully maintained, is not dishonesty. It is discipline. It is knowing when silence serves better than speech, when ambiguity protects position, when letting someone wonder creates engagement that no explanation ever could. The men who mastered this were not lawyers. They were strategic communicators. They understood that every word either strengthens or weakens their frame. The prostitutes understood illusion instinctively. They did not reveal their inner world to every man. They curated perception. They allowed men to project, to imagine, to invest emotionally without receiving full access. And the men did the rest themselves. This same dynamic applied in reverse. The men who allowed women to wonder held attention longer than those who rushed to define everything. Honesty becomes powerful only when it is scarce. When it is given after trust is established, not before attraction forms. When it is offered from a position of strength, not as a plea for acceptance. The men who failed did not fail because they were honest. They failed because they were early. Too early with feelings, too early with intention, too early with certainty. Machiavelli would say they confused virtue with timing. In politics, as in desire, timing is the difference between influence and irrelevance. Reveal too soon and you remove mystery. Reveal too late and you appear distant. The art is knowing when silence creates more pull than speech. The observer noticed something else. Men who overexplained believed they were reducing risk. But in reality, they were increasing it. They were removing their ability to adapt. Once everything was said, there was nothing left to maneuver. No room to respond to shifting dynamics. No leverage to recalibrate. They had fixed themselves in place while the other remained fluid. This is the core Machiavellian insight. Flexibility is power. And over-honesty hardens position. It locks you into a narrative. It hands control of interpretation to someone else. Silence, on the other hand, keeps options alive. It preserves ambiguity. It allows you to move without contradiction. The women felt this difference immediately. Men who spoke too much were predictable. Men who revealed everything were easy to read. Men who maintained a layer of opacity required attention, not anxiety but focus. The mind leaned forward. The imagination engaged. Desire filled the gaps that explanation would have destroyed. This is why illusion outweighs honesty in early attraction. Because illusion invites participation. Honesty delivered without structure ends conversation. It concludes the story before it has momentum. And desire is momentum. The men who understood this did not play games. They simply respected the process. They allowed things to unfold. They did not force clarity where tension was still alive. They did not collapse uncertainty into comfort. They trusted that attraction, like power, grows best when it is not rushed, when it is not over-defined, when it is not exposed to light before it has roots, when it is allowed to remain undefined long enough to become felt, when it is shaped by perception rather than explanation, when it is guided by presence rather than confession, when it is sustained by restraint rather than revelation, when it is protected by silence rather than speech, when it is allowed to become real before it is made true, when it is given space to emerge without being named, when it is permitted to exist without being owned, when it is held without being shown, when it is felt without being explained, when it is sensed without being concluded, when it is allowed to remain unresolved, when it is left open, when it is not sealed with words, when it is not fixed in place, when it is not pinned down by honesty too soon, when it is allowed to breathe in ambiguity, when it is allowed to grow teeth before it is asked to speak, when it is allowed to gather weight before it is asked to justify itself, when it is allowed to remain powerful precisely because it has not yet been made harmless by explanation, when it is allowed to exist in the space where illusion still works, where perception still leads, where mystery still pulls, where the unsaid still carries more force than anything that could be spoken, where power lies not in what is revealed but in what is deliberately left untouched, where the strongest position is not the one that explains itself, but the one that does not need to, where silence becomes language, where restraint becomes signal, where illusion becomes leverage, where truth waits its turn, where revelation is delayed, where nothing is finalized, where nothing is concluded, where nothing is ended, where the story does not close, where the sentence does not finish, where the thought remains suspended, where desire remains awake, where power remains intact, where the illusion holds, where nothing settles, where nothing resolves, where nothing stops, where nothing is wrapped, where nothing is sealed, where nothing is finished, where nothing ends, where everything continues, where the line keeps moving, where the meaning remains open, where the silence stretches, where the understanding is postponed, where the truth remains contained, where the power stays alive, where the words never arrive, where the explanation never comes, where the moment remains unfinished, where the last thing is never said, where the thought keeps hanging, where the air stays charged, where the space stays open, where the voice does not conclude, where the sentence does not end. Listen closely, because this is where most men mistake proximity for power and closeness for control. When access became easy, respect vanished. This was the quiet rule the observer saw repeated without exception. Men believed that physical closeness meant progress, that intimacy automatically followed access, that being allowed near someone's body meant being invited into their inner world. But what the women revealed, without ever stating it directly, was that access can be granted without cost, without risk, without attachment, and without consequence. And anything granted without consequence carries no weight. The men who were closest were often the least significant. They mistook availability for importance. They believed presence equaled priority. Yet the women treated access like a tool, not a bond. They could allow closeness while remaining untouched. They could grant the illusion of intimacy without surrendering leverage. And the men, blinded by proximity, failed to notice that nothing had actually been exchanged. Machiavelli warned that control is not achieved by entering the walls of a city, but by holding what the city cannot afford to lose. Access is entering the walls. Leverage is holding the gate. The men who believed that physical closeness gave them power discovered the opposite. The more access they had without boundaries, the less authority they held. They were inside, but they were irrelevant. This is where contempt quietly forms. Not loud, not cruel, but subtle. The man who accepts access without terms signals that he values proximity more than position. He is grateful rather than selective. He receives rather than chooses. And in doing so, he lowers himself beneath evaluation. The women did not consciously decide to disrespect these men. Respect simply never arrived. The observer noted that the men who were hardest to replace were not the ones most available. They were the ones who limited access. Not through denial, but through standards. They did not treat intimacy as a favor. They treated it as an exchange. They did not confuse being wanted with being needed, and this distinction changed how they were treated. Access without leverage creates familiarity. Familiarity without respect creates boredom. And boredom, once present, poisons attraction faster than rejection ever could. The men who believed constant availability would secure attachment unknowingly trained others to take them for granted. Every unearned closeness reduced their perceived value. Every moment they accepted without boundaries taught others how little was required. Machiavelli understood that power decays when it is overused. Access is power only when it can be withdrawn. When it is constant, it becomes invisible. The women sensed this instinctively. They knew that what is always available is never treasured. And the men who failed did not fail because they were close, but because they were too easy to access without consequence. Intimacy requires risk. It requires exposure on both sides. But when one side exposes everything while the other risks nothing, imbalance forms. And imbalance breeds either control or contempt. The men believed that offering themselves fully would inspire reciprocation. Instead, it invited consumption. They were consumed without being valued. The observer saw men confuse physical surrender with emotional connection. They believed that being allowed close meant being trusted. But trust is not proximity. Trust is power shared carefully. The women could grant access while protecting their center. The men, however, gave access to themselves entirely. And once given, it could not be taken back. This is where Machiavelli's insight cuts deepest. He warned that men lose authority when they give away what should be earned. Access, when given freely, destroys mystery. Mystery sustains desire. The men who maintained distance, not absence, but structure, retained influence. The men who collapsed distance too quickly lost it. The women did not attach to those who were always there. They attached to those who could leave, not because departure was desired, but because the possibility of it created respect. A man who can walk away without drama holds power. A man who cannot becomes furniture. The observer noticed how often men equated sexual access with victory. They believed the goal had been reached, but what they did not see was that the real negotiation had ended the moment they stopped holding boundaries. Access became a ceiling rather than a bridge. Nothing grew beyond it. This is the brutal truth. Intimacy is not granted through closeness. It is granted through restraint, through standards, through the ability to say no even when yes is available. The men who retained this ability were treated as rare. The men who abandoned it were treated as replaceable. The women never said this aloud. They did not need to. Their behavior communicated it perfectly. They invested emotionally where access felt earned. They disengaged where access felt cheap. They responded to men who made intimacy meaningful, not convenient. Machiavelli would recognize this instantly. Power lies not in what you allow others to take, but in what you require before giving it. Access without conditions is surrender. Intimacy without leverage is exposure. And exposure without respect invites exploitation. The men who learned this too late wondered why closeness did not deepen connection, why physical presence did not translate into loyalty, why being there did not make them chosen. They had entered the city without holding the gate. They were inside, but they were powerless. The observer wrote that the greatest misunderstanding was believing intimacy is created by removing barriers. In reality, intimacy is created by choosing whom to lower them for. The women understood this, the men did not, and the difference defined who was remembered and who was forgotten. Access is easy to give. Intimacy is not. Access can be offered without cost. Intimacy demands exchange. The men who accepted access as proof of value stopped negotiating for what mattered. They settled for proximity and lost influence. They gained closeness and lost gravity. Machiavelli taught that authority must be protected more fiercely than affection, because affection follows authority, not the other way around. The men who reversed this order lost both. The men who preserved it held something rarer than access: position. And so the truth revealed itself quietly, without ceremony. That being allowed close means nothing if you are not respected. That intimacy is not measured by how near you are, but by how much you are valued. That access is a doorway, not a destination. That those who confuse the two find themselves inside, surrounded, present, and yet entirely disposable. Standing in the center of proximity, with no leverage left, no boundaries remaining, no authority preserved, no mystery intact, no power retained, no distance to restore, no standard to enforce, no frame to return to, no gate to close, no position to reclaim, no gravity to recover, no respect to summon, no balance to reestablish, no structure to rebuild, no tension to revive, no influence to regain, no intimacy to protect, no way to reverse the exchange once everything has already been given, once access has replaced value, once closeness has erased consequence, once familiarity has dissolved authority, once proximity has mistaken itself for power, once the walls have been entered and the gates left open, once everything is available and nothing is earned, once the lesson has already been written into behavior rather than words, once the dynamic has already shifted beyond repair, once the man is no longer chosen but merely present, once the illusion of intimacy has replaced the reality of leverage, once access has consumed the place where power should have lived, once the truth has already revealed itself without needing to conclude, without needing to resolve, without needing to finish, without needing to end, without needing to be wrapped in a final sentence, without closure, without rest, without an ending, without a stop, without a period, without a conclusion, without the comfort of finality, without the relief of resolution, without the safety of an ending, without anything sealing it, without anything closing it, without anything finishing it, without anything ending it, without anything concluding it, without anything stopping it, without anything completing it, without anything bringing it to rest, without anything ending it here. Now step back and see the full picture. What was uncovered was never about prostitutes, nor about women as a group. That was only the environment where illusion could not survive. When desire was stripped of romance, politeness, and comforting lies, the same rules appeared again and again. Rules that govern attraction everywhere, whether men admit it or not. Machiavelli understood that human nature does not change with titles, vows, or intentions. It only changes its costume. Power remains power. Desire remains responsive to structure, not sincerity. Respect follows self-command, not effort. And intimacy grows where boundaries exist, not where everything is given away. Men fail not because they lack value, but because they reveal it incorrectly. They over-explain where silence would serve them. They plead where presence would be enough. They give access where leverage should have been protected. They confuse honesty with strategy, closeness with power, and emotion with influence. The women in this study did not create these laws. They adapted to them. And the men who suffered were not victims of cruelty, but of misunderstanding. They believed the world rewarded virtue without power. Machiavelli warned that it never has. This knowledge is not meant to harden you. It is meant to sharpen you, to replace fantasy with clarity, to remove resentment and restore agency. Because once you understand the rules, you stop asking to be chosen and start choosing where you stand, and that is where power quietly returns.